Brad Holmes finally said out loud what a lot of Detroit Lions fans have been feeling ever since last season ended. And honestly, it sounds like this organization understood that simply repeating the same formula was no longer going to be enough. The biggest thing that stood out from his comments was not even a specific player or draft pick. It was the mindset change. That was the real story here. Holmes admitted the team took a long, hard look at everything after coming close, but still falling short, and he made it clear they did not want to keep doing the same thing over and over again. For Lions fans, that sentence alone says everything about how serious this offseason really was. Because if we are being honest, this offseason felt different from the beginning. The Lions have built their identity around drafting the best player available no matter the position, trusting development, trusting culture, and trusting continuity. But this year, there was urgency. There was pressure. There was finally a realization that this roster had specific weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. Brad Holmes knew it, the coaching staff knew it, and the fans definitely knew it. The offensive line became one of the biggest concerns the second injuries and departures started affecting the depth of the roster. Losing stability up front changes everything for this offense. Jared Goff depends on protection. This offense depends on timing. Once protection breaks down, the entire machine starts looking different. Holmes recognized that immediately, and instead of overthinking things, the Lions attacked the problem directly. Getting Blake Miller at pick 17 was not flashy. It was necessary, and according to Holmes, they even considered trading up to secure their tackle before deciding against it. Looking back now, that restraint may have been one of the smartest decisions of the entire offseason, because staying patient allowed Detroit to continue building depth across the trenches. And that word keeps coming up over and over again when you look at this roster now. Depth, not just starters, depth. That is something this team desperately needed after what happened with injuries. Lions fans have spent years talking about the all-IR team because every season it felt like important contributors kept getting hurt at the worst possible times. Holmes clearly heard the criticism because this offseason the Lions targeted younger players and players with fewer injury concerns. That was not accidental. That was deliberate. Look at the offensive line additions. When players like Juice Scruggs and Larry Borum were brought in, a lot of people panicked immediately, assuming these were supposed to be major starting solutions. But the real point was roster stability. The Lions were building layers behind the starters because last season exposed how vulnerable the roster became once injuries started piling up. Holmes understood the depth was not good enough, and he corrected it. Then there is the defensive line, which may honestly be the biggest storyline of this entire offseason. For years, Lions fans have been screaming about one issue: finding a legitimate edge rusher opposite Aiden Hutchinson. It became impossible to ignore. No matter how talented the secondary looked or how aggressive the linebackers played, if opposing quarterbacks only had to worry about Hutchinson, they were eventually going to pick defenses apart. Holmes finally attacked that issue directly. Now the Lions suddenly look much deeper up front. Aiden Hutchinson remains the centerpiece, but now there are names like Derek Moore, DJ Wanham, Ahmed Hassanein, Levi Onwuzurike, Aleem McNeil, and Tyreek Williams, giving this front a completely different feel. Even if not every player becomes a star, the rotation itself already looks stronger than what Detroit had before. The Lions are finally building a defensive front capable of consistently affecting quarterbacks instead of relying on one player to do everything alone. And maybe the most interesting part of all this is the tone surrounding Brad Holmes himself. For the first time in a long time, it felt like he understood the pressure coming from the fan base. Detroit fans are no longer satisfied with moral victories or almost moments. That era is over. This team has too much talent now. Expectations changed. Holmes even sounded more reflective and more humble in the way he spoke about the offseason process. There was an acknowledgement that adjustments had to be made. That matters because confidence is good, but in the NFL, organizations get punished quickly if they become stubborn. Holmes appears to have realized that evolution was necessary. The Lions could not simply trust that repeating old habits would magically produce a Super Bowl. They needed to adapt. And from the moves they made, it genuinely looks like they did. One of the biggest examples of that may be Keith Abney. Internally, this feels like a massive addition for Detroit. Holmes himself emphasized the importance of leaving the draft with immediate contributors, and Abney has a real opportunity to become exactly that. There is already talk that he could eventually push for significant playing time in the secondary, especially if somebody underperforms. That type of competition is exactly what strong rosters are built on. The Lions are no longer just trying to survive the season. They are trying to create internal battles everywhere on the depth chart. Even Holmes admitted there are no guarantees. The draft will always involve risk. Some late round players become stars, some some early picks disappoint completely. Nobody truly knows until these players step onto the field. But what stands out is that this offseason finally felt focused. The Lions identified the trenches as the priority and attacked them aggressively. Offensive line, defensive line, depth, youth, competition, those were the themes of this entire offseason. And honestly, that may be exactly what this team needed after coming so close and still walking away frustrated. Detroit is no longer rebuilding. Detroit is chasing championships now. That changes the pressure completely. Every decision matters more. Every weakness gets magnified more. And for the first time, it really feels like Brad Holmes approached an offseason understanding that simply being good is no longer enough for this fan base. So now the question becomes, did Brad Holmes finally make the adjustments this roster needed to truly take the next step toward a Super Bowl? Or do you still think the Lions need one more major move before week 1? The biggest reason this offseason feels so important is because Brad Holmes did not approach it like a general manager trying to maintain success. He approached it like someone who understood the window to win is officially open right now, and that changes everything about how decisions get made. For years, Lions fans were patient because the organization was rebuilding culture, rebuilding talent, and rebuilding credibility across the league. But now, patience is gone. Expectations replaced it, and Holmes sounded fully aware of that reality when discussing the direction of this roster. What really stands out is how intentional the Lions were about fixing weaknesses instead of pretending they did not exist. In previous years, Detroit leaned heavily into trusting development and trusting versatility. This offseason, however, the approach felt more direct and aggressive. The front office identified where this team broke down when adversity hit, and they immediately started reinforcing those areas. That is why so much of the offseason centered around the offensive and defensive lines. When Holmes talked about how deep this roster now feels in the trenches, it was not just offseason optimism. You can actually see the structure forming. The offensive line additions were not designed only for the present season. They were designed to protect the future of the offense as well. Jared Goff operates best when he can stay comfortable in the pocket and play within rhythm. Once pressure starts collapsing the interior, the entire offense changes. Holmes knew Detroit could not allow depth issues to destroy the identity of this team again, and that is why players like Blake Miller suddenly become far more important than casual fans may realize. It is not just about whether he starts immediately, it is about creating long-term stability in front of your quarterback. Holmes clearly believed that if the Lions failed to strengthen the protection unit now, they risked watching the entire offense regress later in the season once injuries inevitably started appearing. The Lions learned that lesson the hard way, but honestly, the defensive line may end up defining whether this offseason succeeds or fails. Detroit could not continue asking Aiden Hutchinson to carry the entire pass rush by himself. Offensive coordinators around the league knew exactly how to neutralize the Lions. Double Hutchinson, move the pocket, get rid of the football quickly, and force somebody else to win. Too often, nobody consistently did. Holmes finally addressed that reality. Now there is legitimate rotational depth that simply did not exist before. Derek Moore brings fresh energy and upside to the edge group. DJ Wanham provides another body capable of creating pressure. Ahmed Hassanin adds even more competition. Inside, Aleem McNeil and Levi Onwuzurike continue anchoring the defensive front while Tyreek Williams creates another possible contributor for the future. Suddenly, this defensive line looks faster, deeper, and far more dangerous than it did before. And what makes this situation fascinating is that Holmes himself admitted they still may not be done. He openly suggested another move could happen before week 1, possibly another defensive addition or rotational piece. That tells you the Lions are still actively evaluating where improvements can be made instead of sitting back comfortably. That is the mentality fans wanted to see. A front office that understands being close is not the same as finishing the job. Another major takeaway from Holmes' comments was how much emphasis he placed on youth and availability. The Lions clearly wanted healthier, younger players this offseason. That was not subtle. Detroit has dealt with too many situations where talented players simply could not stay on the field consistently. Holmes recognized that relying on injured or unavailable talent creates instability across the roster, especially late in the season when championship contenders separate themselves from everybody else. And that is where this offseason feels different philosophically. The Lions are no longer just collecting talent. They are trying to build sustainability. They are trying to survive a full NFL season without the roster collapsing once injuries hit. That requires depth everywhere. Not only stars, but capable backups who can step into meaningful snaps without everything falling apart. Keith Abney is another perfect example of this new mindset. Holmes talked about how important it was to leave the draft with immediate contributors, and Abney may become one of the sneaky important names on this roster. The Lions needed competition in the secondary. They needed insurance if certain veterans struggled or failed to perform consistently. Abney gives them flexibility, and in today's NFL, flexibility matters almost as much as star power. What is also interesting is the emotional tone around this organization right now. Holmes sounded humbled, not weak, not uncertain, humbled. There is a difference. Winning changes expectations, and Detroit fans are no longer willing to accept excuses about rebuilding timelines or future potential. This fan base believes the Lions should compete for championships immediately, and honestly, they should. The talent level is there. The coaching staff is respected, the culture is established, the excuses are disappearing fast. Holmes seemed to recognize that pressure, and in many ways, it may have forced this organization to evolve. Sometimes success can create stubbornness. Teams start believing their formula is untouchable, but the Lions appeared to have avoided that trap this offseason. Instead of blindly repeating past strategies, they adjusted. They became more aggressive in addressing obvious roster flaws. And that may end up being the most important development of all, because in the NFL, windows close fast. One year you are rising contenders. The next year, injuries, roster holes, and missed opportunities can completely change the direction of a franchise. Holmes understands Detroit cannot waste this opportunity, while players like Jared Goff, Aiden Hutchinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and the rest of this core are entering their prime years. Now everything comes down to execution. The paper moves look good. The roster appears deeper. The trenches look stronger. The philosophy feels more urgent. But none of it matters unless the Lions finally take that next step when the season begins. That is the challenge now facing Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell, and this entire roster heading into the new year. If these changes work, this could be the offseason people look back on as the moment Detroit finally transformed from a great story into a legitimate Super Bowl threat. But if the same weaknesses show up again when the pressure rises, fans are going to ask even harder questions next offseason. One thing that cannot be ignored about this entire situation is how much the mentality around the Detroit Lions has changed compared to just a few years ago. There was a time when simply being competitive late in the season felt like progress for this franchise. Now the conversation is completely different. Fans are analyzing roster construction, questioning positional depth, debating pass rush rotations, and expecting division titles every single year. That pressure is real, and Brad Holmes sounded like someone who finally understands that every offseason decision is now tied directly to championship expectations. What makes this offseason fascinating is that Holmes never denied the frustration from last season. In fact, he almost embraced it. He openly talked about the bad taste left after falling short despite feeling like the team was trending in the right direction. That matters because it shows this organization is no longer satisfied with being close. There is a huge difference between a franchise hoping to compete and